Hello, I'm Grant Hickman. I'm a senior product manager here at GitLab, and I work with our security policies and compliance team. I wanted to take a few minutes today to talk through our plans for compliance management. I'll start first by talking about some of the challenges that our customers have in terms of compliance and the opportunity that we see for GitLab. I think it's important first to understand that our customers deal with many different challenges in compliance that extend well beyond GitLab and even beyond software development. Governance, risk, and compliance describes the broader compliance space, and there are many GRC tools that already exist today to help organizations understand risk and meet compliance requirements broadly across their organization. You can see these aspects span across managing policy and procedure documentation, ensuring business continuity, handling complaints, and a lot more. Where we see an opportunity for GitLab is in the IT risk management and compliance management space, as these are most closely tied to the technology. And as I was discussing, GRC can span across many different functional areas. You might think about physical security, the availability of services, operations, and people management. But the opportunity here that we see for GitLab is in the DevSecOps lifecycle. For many of our customers and their business models, they depend heavily on the software applications that they're building and maintaining. Consider, for example, financial applications, healthcare software, large telecoms, and government agencies. For many organizations, disruptions to their production apps or vulnerabilities that slip in during the process of building them, these pose a great risk to their business. So we want to empower customers and build confidence in GitLab as the only DevSecOps tool that truly addresses compliance. This strengthens our position in the market and solves real customer pain points. There are a few ways that we see an opportunity to help customers achieve compliance in DevSecOps. First of all, we can provide visibility to compliance users at each step of the life cycle. We can help users understand where risks are and how they align to their business requirements, whether they're internal or external. They may have security controls that they've defined internally to address business risk, or they may have external pressures from regulatory standards and auditors who are pressuring them to meet these requirements. We also want to give our customers the ability to create controls and to enforce compliance, to actually prevent these behaviors. But we also want to give them data to prove compliance so that they can show to their internal and external auditors that they've addressed gaps and that they have confidence that that all the requirements are properly met. We also want to help users to be able to map those requirements and controls up to relevant standards and frameworks. We want to make the experience more intuitive, make it simpler to onboard, and simpler to manage. And then lastly, we think this can help bring more compliance and security personas into GitLab, where they may not have seats today. If we provide these capabilities and the power that this offers, this will encourage them to use GitLab and be closer to the developer experience itself. So let's talk a bit about how we view compliance at GitLab today. So I'll start by sharing a bit about our vision for GitLab compliance, and then we can go into detail to discuss current capabilities versus roadmap. So at GitLab, we view compliance as a three-pronged approach. We have checks to help us to validate that settings are properly enabled. We have violation events that help to provide evidence of compliance, and then policies to create controls and granularly enforce compliance globally. Another way to look at compliance at GitLab is in terms of observability and enforcement. In terms of observability, we have our standards adherence requirements and checks, violation events, and audit events. These give compliance users a way to understand their compliance posture, to generate reports for auditors, as well as to be able to create their own tooling and automation based on these events. In terms of enforcement, policies help us to manage controls globally, to maintain separation of duties, and these serve as a technical mechanism for taking a requirement from a compliance objective and turning it into a control in GitLab to influence a particular behavior. I think what might help as well is to share a metaphor. So we might think about how how these different terms and this structure applies in our lives. You might imagine the security of our own home. A requirement might be that we don't want any uninvited guests to enter our home. Check in this case, you might relate to a Ring doorbell. So this doorbell might give us insight into who approaches our home and who attempts to enter it. A violation would be an uninvited guest entering our home, and potentially they want to do some kind of damage or something malicious. A control is something that prevents this behavior. It could be a heavy-duty lock on your door or some advanced security system that prevents access. And in spite of the check and in spite of the control, we still want to understand if there has been a breach or of access into our home. So these home entry events, you might think of them as home entry events, actually track data related to people approaching our home. So we might learn that there is a delivery person dropping off an Amazon package. This could be a friend, or it could be our mom stopping by to drop off the casserole. And then the last case or worst case scenario is it could be someone malicious attempting to enter our home. So in this case, we want to be able to capture that data and to be able to prove whether or not this requirement has been addressed, and that's extremely important for our compliance personas. Let's try to relate this into GitLab itself. So let's imagine a requirement that every MR in our organization must be approved by 2 users, and that these users must not be the author or committer of the MR. A check would help us to understand if we properly enabled settings to require the necessary approvals. In this case, you can see that I don't require more than 0 approvals. Therefore, this check would fail. Next, we have our violation event. And when an MR is merged, we can capture an event around that merge request event and identify if there was a violation. And in this case, you can see that there was, as the author has approved and merged their own MR. And the control would be to create a GitLab policy that requires multiple approvers and prevents approval by merge request authors and committers. And this also establishes separation of duties so that only certain users can enable and enforce this, and it can't be circumvented. So in summary, I think what we'll find continuously, consistently, is that there's a structure in terms of our anatomy and in terms of the concepts that we see around compliance. We have the concept of a framework or a standard, and this is a set of requirements that we must comply with. We have checks that can help us to identify if in GitLab, if we are configuring the tool to comply with our requirements. And then violations help us to understand if, in spite of these settings being enabled, if there have been any occurrences that prove that we're not in compliance. And then controls to help us to lock down these settings, establish separation of duties, and ensure that these checks, that these requirements can't be circumvented. So with that, let's shift into our direction and talk about a few of the changes that we've been discussing and opportunities for building out our compliance management capabilities. You might think of this as a proposal. We have some ideas and concepts for the kind of the 3-year vision here, and happy to hear feedback. So first up, we want to give compliance users a better picture at a high level of how their compliance stacks up. So we have this idea for a dashboard view. We'll have cards that help users to click through and get a sense of all the projects in the repository, which projects are failing adherence requirements, where violations may have occurred, and to highlight other relevant features for compliance users. Additionally, you can see you can filter by framework and by date. So you can verify that compliance has been addressed across a span of time. Next up, we have our standards adherence report. We think that this will be one of the primary tools for compliance users. And with this report, you'll be able to drill down by requirement, framework, check, and project to understand where action may be required based on your priorities. We'll also improve this report to better reflect the health status as a combination of enforcement status and violation status. So if checks are failing, or if we have any violations in spite of those checks, it's easier to get a picture of how long we've been in compliance, and if we're not in compliance, how to remediate and address it. So let's take a closer look at this first requirement to require 2 approvers, excluding MR, author, and committer, like we were talking about earlier. So as we open this panel, we can see that this requirement contains 3 checks, and each check influences the status of the requirement. So if you have a single failure, a single check failing, that fails the overall requirement. Today, what we have is a concept of a check. We don't yet have this concept of requirement. So this is an opportunity to really establish that structure and to be able to have checks roll up to a requirement and to provide more context for what our compliance users understand in terms of requirements in their framework. And then lastly, we have violations that represent if there have been any events that prove that there's been a violation of the compliance requirement. So you can quickly get a picture of that directly in the side panel view. In this example, we see that the requirement here is passing. So checks are passing for each requirement. There have been no violations. And you might anticipate perhaps this is a project that was configured on January 2nd. It was properly configured, and we've had no violations since. And so this would definitely provide a lot of positive feelings for our compliance team. Now, let's move on into compliance frameworks. We today have the concept of frameworks, but we do have some limitations. You can only have 1 compliance framework label applied on a given project. And then we've started to introduce this concept of a standard that's separate to a framework and managed within a framework. So what we want to do is actually to evolve this a bit and provide a little more flexibility for our compliance users. And therefore, we're exploring how to apply multiple labels on a given project. So you could have a project that has FedRAMP requirements applied to it, as well as ISO and SOC 2. And what we'd like to be able to do is to evolve these frameworks so that we have default frameworks and associated requirements and checks by default applied, so that you can start to use these frameworks out of the box. So let's dig in and take a closer look there. So as we click through on a framework, you can see that there are requirements by default associated with this, as well as policies that are associated and any violations that have been detected. So out of the box requirements for each framework, such as FedRAMP in this case, will automatically be included, and then within those requirements, default checks. So let's imagine that we wanted to go in and edit this FedRAMP framework and take a closer look there. So from the edit screen, you can modify which requirements are applied, remove default requirements, or create and add new requirements. You can also manage your associated policies. So let's say that you wanted to drill down into your requirements. So again, this is a new concept. We would be introducing a new capability to create and manage custom requirements, and we would provide default requirements for each of our frameworks. So let's imagine that you want to create your own custom requirement. So today, let's say that you don't have CIS as a framework within GitLab by default. So you go in and you could create your own framework or use a default framework and apply a requirement, such as CIS 1.1.3. Let's say in this case, you want to ensure that any change to code receives approval of 2 strongly authenticated users. Once you've done that, you might imagine that you want to apply some supporting documentation. Maybe these are your procedure docs or some external documentation. And then you can apply your own checks. So today we don't have any checks in this new requirement that you've created, so you can add more or create new. This takes you then into the check library. So similar to requirements, you might have some default checks available, and if those do not exist, you can create a new custom check. And in this case, we're going to select these 3 different checks, enforce two-person approval, prevent approval from MR author, and prevent approval from MR committers, and apply those to the requirement. And so you can see here, we applied 3 checks to a custom requirement that we just created. And then lastly, let's say that the default checks that we had in the check library don't suffice or satisfy, we need to create another check. Then that's where you can create, we come into this, this area to create your own custom check. So the UX here, the implementation here is completely open-ended. This is more of a strawman concept, so don't get too hung up on the UI or the capability that is proposed here, but rather imagine a scenario where users can create a custom check, that these checks do not conflict with project pipelines, like you might see with our work on policies for scan execution policies or pipeline execution policies. They would require no or less coordination with project teams. And this would be a simpler process to just enable a check across the org, perhaps with proper permissions baked in to set this up globally. And this would provide a simpler, cleaner UX, which would be differentiating against pipeline execution policies. So instead of necessarily having to enforce this in a pipeline configuration itself per project, this could follow a separate flow and be read-only and informational for compliance purposes. And then once you've created this custom check, it would be applied to your requirement and then available in the check library in case it is relevant to apply to other requirements that you might have across other frameworks, for example. And then circling back, the last thing I wanted to highlight is the capabilities around recent violations. Let's imagine that we are editing a framework. There's an opportunity here to also provide more insight to our customers and to be able to understand violations per framework. And so that's where we see an opportunity here to expand our capabilities for violations, be able to filter as well by framework, by check, by project, and to be able to expand the various violation events that we're servicing there. So once we have this structure in place that aligns with what we discussed at the beginning of this presentation, we then want to populate the capabilities that we're offering here. So we want to be able to provide more checks, more requirements, more violation events. And we want to do this per framework and address cases across the DevSecOps lifecycle. So our priority today to expand requirements and checks and violation events start with SOC 2 checks. We are also exploring implementing checks across all of our security scanners to ensure proper configuration, repository checks, and our GitLab CIS benchmark requirements. We are also exploring other standards and frameworks such as SOC, GDPR, CCPA, HIPAA, ISO, and NIST. And we're continuously talking with our customers, doing research with our customers, and talking to the field. So we're happy to hear, obviously, any feedback from you all, what you're seeing out in the field and with our customers. Feel free to reach out at any point, and would love to hear from you. And then lastly, I'd like to touch on a few of the impacts that I see to our planning based on some of the ideas that I've shared today. First, we expect that this will require adding support for multiple framework labels per project. So we're beginning to do some discovery on what might be involved from an engineering standpoint there. We would like to be able to support default compliance frameworks and checks out of the box, which is a bit of a shift from some of our existing plans. We want to add a concept of requirements, so a new structure that allows users to create, edit, and manage those requirements within custom frameworks and grouping checks under the requirements. We also want to establish a new workflow for creating and executing compliance checks that would be unique and differentiated from security policies, providing a really simple flow for compliance observability to be able to understand your compliance posture. Number 5, we want to establish more organized and simpler views. So being able to get a higher level picture of your compliance posture through a dashboard is something that we see as a change in our plan. We want to add more filtering to violations reporting with navigation from pages to those filtered views. And then, of course, we will be continuing to work to add support for more frameworks, requirements, checks, and violation events based on the feedback and prioritization that we have from our customers. So thanks for walking through all this with me today. This is focused on our direction for the next roughly 3 years. And I'll be sharing more content as we go about more granularly how we see this breaking down into roadmap and planning. But this, for purposes of today's conversation, I wanted to share a little bit about where we're heading, and really excited to hear feedback and thoughts from you all. Thanks for your time.